Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. Heartbreaking images and stories have been emerging from across the country, highlighting the plight of migrant workers during this lockdown. Reports of a mass exodus of migrants has been reported from Delhi, Gujarat, and as well as from other industrialized urban centers of India. While such a mass exodus defeats the very purpose of a lockdown, it has brought out the stark class divide and social divide of the Indian society. This exodus is nothing short of a human tragedy, and it has been caused by the two difficult choices that they have been presented by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown. The choice in front of these migrant workers is to either abide by the lockdown restrictions and stay safe from the pandemic, or to die out of hunger. So let us understand in slight detail as to what factors are responsible for this severe distress that is being faced by the migrant workers during this lockdown period. See, most of the migrant workers work in urban and industrial areas such as the NCR region, Gujarat, Mumbai, Pune, Bengaluru, etc. And a majority of these migrant workers are from relatively backward states such as UP, Bihar, Odisha, etc. And some of these migrant workers work in formal sectors such as manufacturing industries, services, etc. But a vast majority of these migrant workers are employed in the unorganized informal sector that had been thriving in these urbanized industrial zones. But the imposition of a total lockdown has brought both the formal and the informal sectors in these cities to a complete halt, and as a result, millions of migrant workers have lost their livelihoods. So this loss of income has made it impossible for these poor migrant workers to sustain the high cost of living in these cities. And as a result, they are not able to afford even basic necessities such as food and shelter. Plus, the imposition of a total lockdown has made it all the more difficult to access essential items, and it has also left them stranded due to the complete suspension of transportation services. This dire situation has forced thousands and thousands of migrants to walk hundreds of kilometers in order to reach their native places. In order to prevent this suffering, the UP government and the Delhi government tried to arrange buses, which led to these chaotic scenes. So this migrant exodus has to be one of the largest humanitarian crises that India has dealt with in recent times. And it also defeats the very purpose of social distancing. And it also carries the threat of transporting the pandemic, which has largely been restricted to its urban areas, to its rural areas as well. So where does the blame lie for this crisis? Does it lie with the migrants who have failed to abide by the lockdown restrictions? Or does it lie with the manner in which the lockdown has been enforced? Or does it lie with the central and the state governments which have clearly failed to anticipate this crisis? See, we have been discussing over the past few weeks that imposing a complete lockdown is justified in order to contain the spread of the pandemic and break the chain of transmission. It has even been argued that imposing a lockdown is an absolutely necessary step. To be fair, the Indian government, the state governments and governments around the world are dealing with an extraordinary situation, and in such a rapidly evolving situation, governments are expected to make policy decisions when the entire world is passing through uncharted territory. Naturally, such decisions taken by the government might be labelled as drastic and extreme, and it might end up having severe consequences. In response to this migrant crisis, the government of India has said that it has been proactive and it has been swiftly responding to the evolving situation. The government has justified that such a drastic lockdown, which could have severe consequences, was actually needed as a preemptive step. As we have seen over the last couple of months, the government of India has indeed been very proactive, and it has taken a number of preemptive and proactive steps in order to contain the spread of the pandemic. From suspending visas to cancelling flights to supporting states and to imposing a lockdown, the government of India has responded swiftly to this evolving crisis by drawing lessons from other countries. While dealing with a crisis of this scale, even developed countries with their advanced governance and healthcare systems have failed. So it is only natural for a developing country like India to make few policy mistakes, and it is argued that these mistakes become evident only in hindsight or in retrospect. The argument is that some of these mistakes become evident only when you look back and evaluate these policy decisions. The counter argument is that while this justification is valid for few policy decisions, it is not valid with regard to the migrant crisis. Critics have pointed out that if the government had enough foresight and if the government had put enough thought before the imposition of the lockdown, this migrant crisis could have been entirely averted. The government has been criticized for not providing adequate notice and for not creating a safety net for the vulnerable sections before the lockdown was imposed. The government has also been criticized for providing preferential treatment to prosperous Indian citizens while they were evacuated from foreign countries as compared to the discrimination against the underprivileged migrant workers. So in the face of this criticism, let us take a look at the steps that the government could have taken in order to prevent this migrant exodus. See, the experience of other countries such as China, Italy or Spain shows that social distancing can be very effective and very much needed in order to contain the spread of the pandemic and to break the chain of transmission. But for social distancing to be effective, there should be absolutely no mass movement of people. So this means that migrant workers will have to stay put in whichever cities they are currently located in. As the critics have pointed out, if the government had indeed provided prior notice of the lockdown and suspension of transportation services, then it would have provided even more time for the migrant workers, and there still would have been an exodus which would defeat the very purpose of social distancing. And this would also come with the risk of carrying the pandemic to the rural areas as well. But experts argue that prior notice of the lockdown would have helped in preventing the exodus, provided if the government had taken these precautionary measures. See, if you look at the timeline of events, the Prime Minister gave a call for a Janta curfew on the 22nd of March. This call was given by the Prime Minister a few days earlier. After carrying out a drill of the lockdown, a number of state governments imposed a lockdown on the 23rd of March by invoking the Epidemic Diseases Act. Then on the 24th of March, the Prime Minister gave a call for a total lockdown. Then on the 26th of March, the Government of India came out with an economic relief package known as the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana in order to act as a safety net for the vulnerable sections. But experts argue that if the government had slightly altered the sequence of these events, then the migrant crisis could have been entirely avoided. Experts argue that since the threat posed by the pandemic to India had become evident by the 12th of March, the government could have given prior notice before the imposition of a total lockdown. Let's say if the government had notified the lockdown between the 15th and 18th of March, then it would have given adequate time for the public to prepare accordingly. But as we discussed earlier, such prior notice would have still led to a mass exodus. But experts argue that this exodus could have been prevented if the government had announced a substantial relief package prior to the imposition of the lockdown. See, instead of coming out with a relief package a few days after the lockdown had come into effect, the government could have announced a substantial safety net with specific provisions directed at the migrant workers prior to the imposition of the lockdown. For example, the government could have guaranteed a basic income to migrant workers who have lost their jobs. Before the lockdown was imposed, the centre should have worked with all the state governments to set up adequate shelters and relief camps. It could have even made adequate arrangements for essential items such as food by setting up community kitchens. So the argument is that if these safety measures had been implemented prior to the imposition of the lockdown, then we might have averted this mass exodus of migrant workers. But unfortunately, this relief package, which was announced after the lockdown came into effect, does not contain any substantial benefits for the migrant workers, and this is one of the reasons why we are currently witnessing this humanitarian crisis. Then the other argument is that India could have considered other alternatives to a lockdown by drawing lessons from the strategies of other countries such as South Korea, Singapore, Japan, etc. These countries have relatively managed to contain the spread of the pandemic without resorting to the imposition of a complete lockdown. But as the migrant crisis unfolded, the central government has responded swiftly, and it has directed all the state governments to make use of the funds that are available under the State Disaster Response Fund in order to immediately set up relief camps for migrant workers. See, the State Disaster Response Fund that has been established by the Disaster Management Act is the primary fund that is available to a state government to deal with a disaster. A majority of this fund is sponsored by the central government. The center provides 75% of the funding for general category states, and it provides 90% of the funding for special category states. So the central government has directed the state governments to work with NGOs and volunteers and make use of these funds in order to immediately set up relief camps, especially along highways. By setting up these relief camps, the state governments can provide for temporary accommodation, free food, clothing, medical care for the migrant workers who have been facing severe distress due to the imposition of the lockdown. The center has even asked the states to publicize the location of these relief camps and spread awareness about them by making use of social media platforms, print media and electronic media, and as well as public address systems. Now let's take up the next article. The Prime Minister has called upon the public to make donations to the newly established PM CARES Fund in order to help India combat the COVID-19 pandemic. PM CARES stands for Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance and Relief in Emergency Situations Fund. This newly constituted emergency fund has been set up as a public charitable trust, and the Prime Minister himself acts as the chairman of the trust. Apart from the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Home Minister and the Finance Minister, they will act as members to this trust. And any expenditure from this emergency fund has to be authorized by the Prime Minister himself. So in its constitution and structure, the PM CARES Fund is quite similar to the Prime Minister's National Relief Fund, which already exists. This fund had been established by then Prime Minister Nehru in 1948 in order to help out the victims of partition who had been displaced from Pakistan. After serving this purpose, the Prime Minister's National Relief Fund is being used to provide financial support during natural disasters such as earthquakes, cyclones, etc. It is also used to provide financial support to victims of communal riots. It is also used to fund medical treatment of selected patients who are undergoing expensive procedures such as kidney transplant, cancer treatment, reconstruction surgeries for acid attack victims, etc. But please remember that both the PM CARES Fund and the PM National Relief Fund does not receive any budgetary support from the government. There is no separate budgetary allocation that will be made by the government. Both the funds are entirely sponsored by the public. That is, the resources are raised through public contribution. The contribution made by the public is entirely exempted from income tax, and the donors can even claim a deduction in their income tax. Now let's take up the next article. As the number of COVID-19 cases have been rapidly rising in India, the Indian government is trying to shift its focus to a couple of hotspots that have emerged. These two places have reported the emergence of multiple COVID-19 cases, and the government is treating them as hotspots for the pandemic. Bhilwara in Rajasthan is a hub for the textile industry. In fact, Bhilwara is also known as the Textile City of India or the Manchester of India. And Kasaragod is a small coastal town in Kerala. Both these places have reported the emergence of multiple cases over the last few weeks, and hence they have emerged as the hotspot for the COVID-19 pandemic in India. So the central government has decided to shift its focus to these two hotspots and work with these two state governments in order to step up community surveillance, contact tracing, and implement an effective containment strategy in order to prevent the formation of a larger cluster, which is a prerequisite for community transmission to take place. So the government is trying to give dedicated attention to these two hotspots in order to prevent community transmission from taking place. Now let's take up the next article. The Ministry of Human Resources and Development is planning to launch a distance learning program in order to ensure continuity in schooling. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, schools across the country have been closed. And since it is uncertain as to when the schools could resume, it could break continuity in schooling and affect the learning outcomes of school children. So in order to prevent this from happening, the HRD Ministry has decided to launch a distance learning program for classes 9 to 12. This virtual learning program will be delivered through dedicated TV channels and radio channels across the country, and the content would be available for both Hindi medium and as well as English medium. And in order to ensure that the program is in line with the NCERT syllabus, the HRD Ministry has tasked the National Institute of Open Schooling to devise a structured program by working along with the NCERT. But however, this program could create challenges for state boards due to the language barrier. And in order to overcome this language barrier, the HRD Ministry has offered the DIKSHA mobile application, which can help in providing the content in local languages. DIKSHA stands for Digital Infrastructure for Knowledge Sharing. This mobile application was launched in 2017 by the HRD Ministry in order to provide a digital platform for enabling learning amongst teachers and as well as amongst the students, and as well as to enable the creation of content in local languages. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. Kerala has requested the central government to relax the fiscal responsibility and budget management rules in order to enable the state to fight effectively against the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. See, we have discussed over the last few days that every government needs to take the risk of breaching its fiscal discipline and fiscal targets if it has to fight against the economic impact of the pandemic and if it has to protect the weaker and the vulnerable sections. In India, fiscal discipline and fiscal targets are enforced through the FRBM Act, which was enacted by the Parliament in 2003, and under this legislation, the FRBM rules were notified in 2004. This legislation and these rules prescribe a set of fiscal targets for the central government and as well as the state governments. And the government, especially the state governments, cannot fight effectively against the socio-economic impact of the pandemic without taking the risk of breaching their fiscal targets. Considering that we are dealing with an extraordinary situation, breaching fiscal targets becomes absolutely necessary if the government has to provide for a substantial economic stimulus. See, the Kerala government has become one of the first state governments in India to announce a massive economic package amounting to around 20,000 crore rupees. But by providing this economic stimulus, Kerala runs the risk of breaching its fiscal targets. Hence, it has requested the central government to relax the FRBM rules so that it creates enough fiscal space for Kerala to effectively fight against the economic impact of COVID-19. Such a relaxation of fiscal targets can be provided by making use of Section 4, Clause 2 of the FRBM Act. This section provides for an escape clause, and by using this provision, governments can breach their fiscal targets on the grounds of national security, war, natural calamity, financial instability, etc. In fact, there have been quite a few precedents for this in the past. There have been a few instances where the fiscal deficit targets and the deadlines prescribed by the FRBM Act have been relaxed by the central government. For example, when the Indian economy was severely hit during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the fiscal deficit targets and deadlines were relaxed and revised. More recently, the budget of 2020-21 also provides for a relaxation in the fiscal deficit targets and the deadline. Now let's take up the practice questions. Which of the following statements are correct? The Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India, or IRDAI, is a statutory body under the Ministry of Finance. It is a 10-member body including the chairman, 5 full-time members and 4 part-time members, and all are appointed by the Government of India. FDI is not allowed in the insurance sector. Amongst the given statements, statements 1 and 3 are incorrect. So option B is the right answer. See, the IRDAI is a statutory authority. It has been established through an act of the Parliament. But it is not under any ministry. It is an autonomous organization responsible for regulating the insurance and reinsurance sectors of India. So this makes the first statement incorrect. And the third statement is also incorrect because FDI is allowed in the insurance sector. So the correct answer is option B, 2 only. This question has been asked because this article on page number 9 makes a reference to the IRDAI. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following drugs or treatments are being considered for treating COVID-19? Is it hydroxychloroquine or lopinavir or ritonavir or remdesivir or plasma or antibody therapy? The correct answer is option D. All the 5 are being considered as possible drugs or treatments for treating COVID-19. Yesterday we discussed that a few existing drugs are being considered by governments and the World Health Organization for their potential to treat COVID-19. This includes hydroxychloroquine, which is an anti-malarial drug. It also includes lopinavir and ritonavir, which are anti-HIV drugs. It also includes remdesivir, which was developed to treat Ebola and Marburg. These 4 drugs are being considered under the solidarity trials that are being conducted by the World Health Organization, and the objective of these trials is to use these drugs in combination and repurpose them for treating COVID-19. This strategy has shown some success in a few cases around the world, including few cases in Rajasthan. Then in a few cases it has been noticed that plasma therapy or antibody therapy seems to be working as an effective treatment against COVID-19. See, plasma is essentially present in our blood, and the blood of recovered patients contains antibodies against COVID-19. Under this therapy, from the antibody-rich blood of recovered patients, plasma can be extracted, and through plasma transfusion, infected patients can be treated. So this therapy is also being considered by the World Health Organization and the US FDA. This question was asked because according to this article on page number 14, plasma transfusion does hold promise for treating COVID-19. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following microorganisms are usually held responsible for food contamination and food poisoning? Is it Salmonella or Clostridium or E. coli? All the 3 are correct. Option D is the right answer. All 3 are bacteria and they are responsible for food contamination and food poisoning. This question has been asked because an article on page number 10 refers to a research related to E. coli. Now let's take up the next practice question. Who was the chairman of the committee that was set up to review the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act? The correct answer is option D, N.K. Singh. This review committee was constituted in 2016 and it has already submitted the report as well. And also remember that N.K. Singh is also the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. The Food and Agriculture Organization accords the status of globally important agricultural heritage system to traditional agricultural systems. What is the overall goal of this initiative? To provide modern technology, training in modern farming methods, and financial support to local communities of identified GIAHS so as to greatly enhance their agricultural productivity, or to identify and safeguard eco-friendly traditional farm practices and their associated landscapers, agricultural biodiversity, and knowledge systems of the local communities, or to provide geographical indication status to all the varieties of agricultural produce in such identified GIAHS. The correct answer is option B, 2 only. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, the lockdown imposed to tackle COVID-19 has caused severe distress to migrant workers. What preemptive steps could have been taken by the government to ease their suffering? The second question, discuss briefly the provisions of the FRBM Act of 2003 and justify why its provisions need to be relaxed to help India combat the economic impact of COVID-19. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post them in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.